which we can benefit from learning from you in this way. I wonder if you could think about the indigenous populations. What is the most worrying about the disconnect of the West from the native roots? When we think about being worried about what is the loss that is there?
That's such a big and powerful question. I had a mentor named Cecilia Garcia who was Chumash, and I think many indigenous people in many different tribes dealt with their first experience of the missionaries, the colonial system, in different ways. And one of the ways that the Chumash people, navigated that initial kind of collision of cultures is that they were not even willing to look at people that were not of their tribe, that did not come to them in a humble way, that did not come bearing gifts or asking for acknowledgement or asking for the ability to pass in a respectful manner. So I think when you think about the different ways that people have navigated that original conflict, the reason that I've always wondered why those folks would not even look at the Spanish that came to this area. And to me, it's because they did not want to integrate or even acknowledge on some basic level that those people were coming with the intentions that they brought. And so I think that different tribes and different indigenous folks have endeavored in very, very different ways to either kind of refuse the essential presence of colonizers, and others have incorporated their presence. So it's as different as the Muskogee Creek in Oklahoma, who sing Christian songs in their churches in Muskogee language, to the people in, like I say, the Chumash, who initially would not even acknowledge the presence or the right to presence of the settlers that came here. And I think each kind of system within each culture functioned to maintain itself relative to that culture's cultural and social norms. And so different tribes have preserved their way of knowing, their way of understanding themselves in different ways. And I think that has been really essential to kind of maintaining some of the foundational elements of those cultures that are being in some ways restored today through language development, through the land back movement, through so many things that are bringing back what was before. And that happens in many different ways in different places. For people on reservations, that kind of historical ancestral knowledge can be very close. For people like me, raised in the suburbs of Los Angeles, gathering those elements has been a messy conversation that I've had with myself for 30 years, just to reconstruct for myself the kind of pillars, the orientation of my own existence, and how I can function relative to those different places and cultures and peoples in a respectful way. And I've failed a lot, but for some particular reason, I've kept at it, and I've been determined to be okay with failure and to be messy in my experience, and try to take criticisms and challenges and other people's perceptions of me seriously, so that those are also incorporated in my story and my own investigation in myself as deeply as I can make it, so that I can move somehow across the span of my life from being something of an imposter, something of someone playing with perception, to someone that's coming into a deeper space of knowing and truth with myself and my own story. But I think for so many people, myself included, there's a time and place in our life where we're imitating, and that's a stage of development. And throughout the development of our own story and our ways of knowing, we come to a place of maturity where we come to accept the stories that we've told ourselves as being frail and fragile and needed in times of pain and transition and growth, and ultimately providing us the tools for survival that we needed to take steps toward a greater truth. So that's my experience of these things. I think that you know, for the world that we live in, we're constantly consuming stories so quickly, so rapidly, that we can be very quickly and easily diluted and redirected from that investigation or that kind of persistent search for stories that are connected to our bloodline, that are connected to our resources, that are connected to our privilege, whatever it may be that has helped us to arrive the place that we are. But it's beautiful to see for myself and the work that I've done over the course of my 50 years now, that there's a tremendous amount of hope in the work that is being done through language revitalization, through the land back movement, through the little cultural expressions that are happening on reservations and here in Los Angeles on a daily basis. The Tongva language has been, in many ways, I hate to say saved, but preserved in some capacity. There are so many little wins. There are so many miracles within the cataclysms that are all around us that are happening simultaneously, that it gives me hope and it fuels my fire. I don't know if that's helpful at all. It's my story.
Well, you're sharing yourself with us, and this is, we're really gifted and grateful to have you here sharing this. You're talking about this idea of land and language, retrieving land and language, and that has been part of the activism of the indigenous population ever since displacement started to become pervasive. And are there other examples of activism and resistance that you found effective through the stories that you are aware of? I think we mentioned when we were talking, you mentioned about the pipeline, Dakota. Is that one that is something that you could comment on, or you find another powerful example of that? Because it's again story and land. Where are the resistant principles that are at work there?
I think I think it would be most helpful. I'd like to talk about it in kind of broad terms.
Sure.
There is a history of there is no separation, I should say, in the indigenous cultures that I have been embedded in for many years, between resistance and prayer, between resistance and ceremony. I think we often in the Western world, to use a very loose term, think of resistance as being separate from everyday life, from the ceremonial life. My friends and relatives, and I encourage people to check out, if I'm boring you, check out the NDN Collective. They're the group that I worked with and had bosses with for many years, that are some of those that are, essential pieces of this land back movement. When I was a young man, I went to South Dakota for the Bigfoot ride when I was about 20 years old. And the Bigfoot ride memorializes and commemorates the event and the massacre that happened at the Wounded Knee, December 29th, 1890. And during that ride, you could think of it as activism insofar that people are for themselves decolonizing. They're reclaiming themselves. They're acknowledging the loss that happened. They're going through a process of grief, but they're also using their physical bodies as part of this journey of healing and personal sacrifice. Another really important ride that happened that I participated in and worked and volunteered around is the Dakota 38+2 ride, which is in recognition of the largest mass hanging of people at Mankato in eastern South Dakota. And so these rides, these acts of resistance have kind of developed a spirit amongst the people that has kind of been a resurgence. And I say activism and prayer are not separate from culture. They're not separate from language. They're not separate from the grandmas and the grandpas that, drive their loved ones to school in the morning and in the same breath pick up commodity goods, and at the same day take up a donation so that their 13-year-old son can go on one of these rides through the winter across South Dakota. It's all part of that continuum of resistance that has been occurring really since some of those first initial clashes and those first initial agreements were broken amongst the settlers and the settler colonists and those that were here.
Broken agreements, broken words. Thank you, David. Right now we're reaching the point in the messy session where we welcome participants, audience, to pose your questions in the chat. And thank you, Kat, for pasting the link to the Indian collective in the chat, so for everybody to find it. Thank you so much. But you have questions, comments, complaints with David, comments for me. David, let's see. We can keep talking.
One, and I'm going to work back through these, if that's okay. And just interrupt me, anyone. And Rosa, David, yes, please just interrupt me. But mapping is a huge part of what is happening in the land back movement. Because of the different acts of Congress that transpired over the years, 1928 allotment, lots of stuff that happened over the years fragmented what was a unified land ultimately into parcels and allotments, right? So mapping is happening as part of the land back movement as the different tribes empower themselves to challenge legal precedent so that they can gain access to their land. And ultimately land, labor, and capital, transforms the resources and the sovereignty through which people experience their life. As far as a mapping of sacred sites in particular, the sacred sites movement really, which kind of preceded the land back movement, was a huge part of my life in my late 20s and 30s. I don't know if there is really a unified place to look those things up, but I think that it's really important to say that it's important to go to the people where you want to seek that information through their tribe. If they have a website or they have a supported group of activists or people doing that work, to see how you can support. I think it's kind of nice as an academic project to consider all the languages in North America or all the different sacred sites, but the place-based work is where change happens. And I think that generally people that whether you go to the Fredonino Tatavium here in Southern California or whether you go to the Oglala Sioux in South Dakota, there are people that have been a part of that continuum of resistance, language restoration, land back for 400, 500 years. So that's mapping, socio-cultural opening to indigenous views and perspectives in the past few years. From your perspective, do you have an understanding of why this is happening now in this moment? For me, It's about representation. Another great organization to check out is Illuminatives, as the visibility of Native people it has kind of it has not happened as an accident. It has happened again as a continuum of struggle and resistance that people have won small battles, whether it be for the Washington Commanders, formerly known as the Washington Redskins, all the things that have traditionally subverted and kind of undermined indigenous visibility have been slowly whittled away at. It was foretold, it was said that it would take 7 generations for the damage that was done to start to resolve itself, and for the people's visibility and sovereignty to start to be reclaimed. And I think that that's just a matter of the work that we do playing out over a series of generations. We always say that the work that we do is the generation that we're in as a result of the 3 generations that influenced us as we work for the 3 generations to come. That's about as far as we can see, and we should endeavor to see in our own lives to appreciate. Certainly it can be farther, but it's not just us ourselves, but it's the 3 before us and the 3 that are coming. So I don't think it is I don't think it's any accident, David.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. I want to elaborate and give a little bit of context on my question and see if that pushes your answer further. When I was in graduate school, I participated in a research project, a nationwide research project that looked at changing communities and how, a community that was once one thing demographically was becoming something else, and then what was happening to those communities in the process. So the community I studied was here in Los Angeles in the West Adams area, which for a long time had been a predominantly African American community, but was increasingly becoming Latina community. And of course, the reason for the shift was demographics and politics. And so in working with them, doing my research, I heard over and over again that the window for the African American community's issues was closing because the demographics were closing, right? That they were being vastly outnumbered by Latin American persons. So it's interesting to me that, at least as I read it, in these last however many years, there's been an openness to indigenous perspectives and openness to indigenous input and traditions in a way that I've never seen in my life. And it can't be demographic. And so I wonder what's going on. And I appreciate your sort of traditional spiritual 7 generations response. I don't know if the context of my question spurs any other ideas for you in terms of why is this happening now?
I apologize. I don't understand how that relates to the kind of population shift contextual piece that you shared. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how the relationship between the population shift, just in terms of numbers and demographics?
Sure. Just very briefly, like if numbers increase and become dominant or at least notable, then we start to listen, right? We being the general population starts to listen, starts to pay attention, perhaps maybe in an open way or maybe in a resistant way. And so that's the connection, just that, there's more people, more voices, more activity, more political power, more threat, more whatever. There's just more because there's more of them.
So for me, there's 2 parts to that. To me, there is the visibility and the representation piece. That is, folks like Deb Haaland, Secretary of the Interior, You know, she's in a position of power that she's a decision maker now. Things that are now part of the mainstream conversation in politics that never were before, because because we've had successes, we've had wins of getting folks like her elected. Sharice Davids, Democrat from Iowa, was my former boss at Thunder Valley CDC. She's LGBTQ, MMA fighter. My former boss, one of the most badass, awesome ladies ever. You know, she's a decision maker. She's an influencer. You know, I think there's so many factors, so, you know, sociologically speaking, that kind of have to do with the way voice is shared and the paradox between the relative availability of story and life experience, and also being bombarded with it and the opportunities that come along with it. I think that there's also, when we talk about this kind of continuum of story over generations and where humanity is at right now, I think we're in just a tremendously vulnerable place as human beings, and I think that also opens us up to listening in a unique way. We're at the same time more we're more secure in North America in terms of our resources than we ever have been, but at the same time we're more deprived of the human experience in day to day. Just trying to fit in time to go to a ceremony, you know, just trying to fit in time to be with other people is something you've almost got to schedule, right? So there's this paradox again in our experience that kind of separates us from being human, and that kind of perpetuity of experiences that remind us of our story and who we are, that is required, in my opinion, to get quiet in yourself. And so I think as a result of that, we're open, we're listening, we're searching. I think human beings, particularly those that aren't connected to that continuum of life's experiences handed down from their grandmothers, we've got to find something in order to survive. And I think there's a part of us that knows that, that's seeking, that's yearning, that's exploring, that knows that the story that we're being sold is just not really enough. So that's why we're here today, right? So.
Thank you for that, David.
We have another question for you, David. Thank you for that. From Lore. Lore, do you want to ask your question? Should I read it?
Oh, it doesn't matter to me. Sure. Yeah, I can ask it. So I'm curious if you could talk about how you think or conceptualize or feel about the idea of decolonizing blank. I said therapy because I'm a therapy student. And just how, if you have any thoughts on how white or non-Indigenous folks can participate in that endeavor or not.
I think you're in the right place, and I think that we're all doing the heavy lifting to try to do that, whether you're Indigenous or not. I think that we've assumed for ourselves in a Foucaultian way, you know, the world that has come to inhabit us, whether we like it or not, whether it's going to the the office at the Bureau of Indian Affairs to pick up the commod foods, it changes your patterns of existence. Whether it's seeking to get your kids back from a boarding school, whether it is being sent to Sherman Indian School in Riverside from Oklahoma in order to get an education. There are so many things that we've assumed as being part of life in the Industrial Revolution, and now the technology revolution, the information revolution. There are so many things that we have assumed that are just are, that have come to inhabit us. And to me, that's all part of colonization. And that happens most readily and easily when we aren't connected with our story or actively seeking it or sustaining it. So how do we decolonize? There's no one size fits all, unfortunately, path for that. And even those in Indigenous communities that have constructed a doctrine or a path with a specific set of steps in order to get there. You know, some of those folks think in the most binary way of anybody I know, and they're native, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a native or a racial thing. I think it's kind of an outlook on life that is very nuanced and non-binary. That's the way I have come to approach decolonization. You can't just get there because you decide to eat organic food or work at your local farm. It's kind of the compilation of all your choices living or trying to live in the most vulnerable, humble way that you can, with relationship to those around you that you serve. So whether you're a David Tripp or a Rosa, Garza, Mourino, or Al Erdenast, there's someone that has had the willingness to live your life in sacrifice, willingness to be generous, and deriving your own identity through those that you have come to serve is really for me, the most key characteristic of someone that is seeking to be related to the world around them, both the place and the people. So I'm sorry I don't have a clear, it's a hard one for me because I try to construct it all the time. My colonized mind is trying to create the formula, but the only formula is really to kind of be human. So.
Thank you so much.
And Kat, you have a question as well. Thank you, David, and thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. I really just adore what you just said about being able to connect to our stories. Do you have any insight on how we can do this in small ways within a university context so that we can make that process of living in the vulnerable, humble way more of our daily practice?
Beautiful and heavy. I think for me, that's a really important question. For me, there's kind of two sides of my family. There's the family that I was adopted into, and those are a huge part of who I am. But when I came back to Antioch, I was at a period in my life where I called it coming out of the teepee. I moved back here from the reservation. I'd spent 15 years of my life, like literally, you know, hauling flagstone in New Mexico, you know, corralling horses in South Dakota. And what I did next when I got to Antioch was I asked Mihi Hyun, you know, how am I going to get credit for what, you know, my story? And she said, well, create a course. And so we created the oral history practicum. And I can't remember which of these wonderful teachers was my evaluator, facilitator for that particular course, but I got a tape recorder back before there were iPhones, and I went and I started spending hours on end with my dad. Went and started spending hours on end with my mom, you know, asking her to talk to me about our Muskogee history, what she knew of it. And and then I wrote those things down, and then we created a lens for inquiry, you know, that kind of situated those stories and my methodology within an academic framework, and that became a few units. So, I mean, that's what's so incredible about Antioch, right? Is that it's not asking you to just live your life and explore your world in a prescriptive way. It's asking you to figure out what you want to learn and how you're going to learn it. And so I mean, I think that you could create an oral history practicum, or you can figure out whatever it is that is essential to your story and go to one of these incredible teachers and just figure out how to put it into learning objectives and outcomes. Before you know it, the outcomes are different than they were when you wrote them.
Thank you, David. Sarah Beth, you have a question.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for the commercial. I love what you're saying, and I really appreciate it. Anytime we encourage students to go for what it is they really want to understand.
David, you remind me of that connects your comment to Lore and to Kat. how there's some sort of a, what if the colonizing could be if we all pretend that we are amnesic natives that lost our background, and then we pretend that we are amnesic, that we are all experiencing a collective amnesia, that we forgot where we came from, and start a search like the one David did with his oral history project. And just, putting that out there. Any other?
Is there a question? I mean,
there are no more questions here, just comments.
Okay.
There's
Asa.
Yeah.
Asa. Yes, Asa. Sorry. Sorry, my blindness.
Oh, no problem. I just raised my hand. But thank you, David. It's really great to hear from you and your experience at Antioch. Wondering if you still have those tapes, actually. But my question actually is around the recent vote in Australia. I don't know if you followed that over the weekend with the Aboriginal peoples who were trying to get a representative voice in government, and it was voted down. And I'm thinking about that role of like representation in the U.S. government. And I know you mentioned some elected leaders, and but kind of the relationship between Indigenous communities, Native peoples, and like the state, and how you view that changing as, there a history of like autonomous nations making treaties with each other versus now more of like a inside of the larger nation, and just kind of maybe where you see that going. There's a lot in there, so whatever you want to take from that.
So for me, most importantly, I think it's for me, and this is just for me, it's change for me happens and needs to happen like first in individuals, families, communities, tribes, and then outward. So like the center of that set of concentric rings, starts right there with you, right? And the next person that you reach out to, maybe it's the Ferdinandos, maybe it's the Sacred Places Institute. I have no experience with them. Maybe it's going to the, Pavungna powwow, whatever it is, you make that next connection, right? But it starts with you and it works outward. When we try to conceive of systems that solve problems that, that we use to affect or challenge the system within the system, I think that they very easily become diluted and become kind of pieces of that machine. So, I'm a very, that's kind of just my orientation. I know that we need both, but what sustains me is being a part of the ceremonies at the sacred sites, the ceremonies, the powwows, the places that that for my own healing, for my own ability to come to terms with myself, I need to be a part of seeing and experiencing that change that's happening on the ground. So I think that what's happening, in Australia, and I was following that a little bit. I think that that's like kind of like a step in the right direction, but I think there's kind of also a kind of pan Indigenous experience that is kind of bubbling to the surface as a kind of vicarious combination of so many of the lessons learned from different tribes, whether you're Lakota, whether you're Ferdinando. The land back movement is really this kind of culmination of all these simultaneous awarenesses that have happened throughout Indian country that are challenging, what it means to be a steward or an owner of a piece of land, and also in doing so deconstructing colonialism, and challenging, what the value system, what the operating system is, that is most sustainable for that piece of land, whether it is the Western Euro-Christian value system, or whether the system of knowing and living that was here prior to that might be more sustainable. And I think, what's always challenged, if you're Christy Nome in South Dakota, still the mindset is that these natives aren't smart enough to manage land. Look at them. They can't even take care of their children. Those are the thoughts that are running through her head. But the collective self-determination and activism, and the collective renaissance of these cultures that has come together has kind of created these moments of this movement that is rising in land back, that I think can really affect the way people see land in North America and globally, and redetermine our orientation towards the commons, and ultimately challenge the rugged, ragged individualism that we currently live in now, because we all belong to the land and we're all going to be a part of it. So we might as well try to explore, investigate value systems that teach us how to share rather than just buy for ourselves all day long. Sorry if that's incredibly bleak, but for me, it's incredibly hopeful, because while there is destruction going on around us all the time, there's also, people that have been rising up for hundreds of years that, are determining what the course will be for them, and who will decide what that course will be. Somebody else, come on, I'm having fun here now.
Well, there's a comment from Mark here. Mark, do you want to make your comment verbally?
Well, I think I tried to type it, but David, I find it very hopeful. It's not at all bleak. The truth is we are part of the land, and to state that and recognize that's where we come from, that's where perhaps our obligation is, or at least our recognition for our future. That's a very welcoming, hopeful statement as far as I'm concerned, because it's so true. Thank you.
Yeah. And when
John
I was
Trudell said it better than me by far.
when I was preparing for this, I was investigating the ancestral tribes of the territories where Antioch is, and I found this. Once I'm gonna post in the chat, guys, that investigation. And then I was hearing about, I want you to know what you think, David, about this. There's a Native American scholar, I don't have right now the reference, but that in addition to acknowledging land, that is now something that we see more often in institutions, in addition to acknowledge the land, was recommended to have at least one historical piece that brings into sharp focus the kind of like a despair and that is part of the history of that displacement, right? So it's not only the acknowledging that, but also bring up some kind of this happened, like a tiny piece of history, bring it up, look, save it from erasure. So what do you think about that, David?
There's an old saying I like, spend time asking yourself the question, who am I? But spend more time asking yourself, what am I willing to do? And to me, there's an analogy there for the whole land back movement. It's one thing to acknowledge. It's one thing to say, where am I? Who am I? Well, now what are you willing to do? And there are statements of intent, policy statements that many tribes, including, for example, the Ferdinandos, the Tongvas, the Oglalas, they have set an intention and they have urged folks like us to set an intention when they do their land acknowledgement for themselves, but also for the conversation about what it is that they're willing to do if they want to be an ally. So the Tongva just got a bunch of their land back. The Oglalas are working on, it's the 29 Palms Band of Mission Indians, I heard, and I haven't gone deeply into this. They got a piece of Joshua Tree National Monument. How well have we done, operating and sustaining that place? Maybe it's, the Kemuevi's turn, the 29 Palms folks, So you can find a way to operationalize, to put into power, your prayer, your intention. And as you set that intention, this is the land that I'm on, I acknowledge it. Well, now what are you willing to do? And to me, that's your story. That's your path, is finding some way to lend your voice, lend your energy, lend your work to the folks that have been in the struggle for time immemorial, to join it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm trying.
I think I'm speaking also for others they cannot thank you enough for sharing today's space, David, bringing us this conversation. We're reaching the end of the hour, where people normally come from 4 to 5, but those who want to extend your stay, we are going to be hanging out here for another at least 15 minutes. Please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much for those of you that came for this period of time. Really, it's incredibly humbling for me to be able to share some words with you. Thank you. It fills my heart up, and I hope that your heart is full today, and you remember those around the world that are suffering today, and we do something for those folks in your own way.
Of course, a reminder, come back next week for Consuelo Flores and a conversation about Day of the Dead. David, to get this more informal part of the conversation going, I've got another question for you. First, hope you have your chat on so you can see all the love that's coming in for you. So big thank you from all of us connected to Messy Conversations. The last comments that you were making as you were speaking, I was thinking also about allyship that was in the title for today's and I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are around allyship, but both, I guess, for individuals who in their heart are moved to position themselves as allies with Native American, Indigenous peoples, but also like an institution like Antioch. If Antioch wanted to explore how it could be more of an ally to Indigenous communities. Just wondering if you have thoughts around those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I could rock that one for a long time.
All right, let's do it.
But just for starters, so the Lakota word, the word for Lakota means allies. And if you think about, if you journey back in your mind 200 years, well, an ally wasn't between individuals necessarily. Ally would be the Ocheti Shakowin, the 13 original bands of the Lakota people, and they came together to be allies, right? And that's where that word came from. There's individual bands, the Sioux, the Oglala, the Sichangu, the 13 all different bands. So our communities are reorienting themselves in unique and new ways. But I think I kind of challenge this the this word of ally that has been thrown around so much lately. Well, how can I be a good ally? Well, I think of it more in terms of like how your community can partner with another community. So for me, David, I really appreciate David's question of how can this institution, rather than just, individuals under the colonized model, right? How can this community of folks, mobilize itself in order to make a difference? And of course, it starts with the conversations like this that hopefully challenge us in our own path and our own course. And then ultimately, conversations that I know are happening almost, sometimes at Antioch in a way that feels like it, disempowers the institution, because there's so many divergent opinions or so many kind of essentialisms that come into play that determine the course of what the organization will do. But I can just say that those conversations for me, in determining, what the consensus and the traditional meaning of that word is, you know what I mean? It's not just a majority, but it's the vast majority of the folks, that are a part of that community that sign up for that policy statement or that agenda or that determination of what the course will be. And of course, that consensus is very hard to reach. Takes time. It can take generations. It's one of the reasons that this clash of cultures resulted in what it resulted into. When you have a command and control society that has one person that has control over 50 million, then you can put those people to war, flick of a switch, right? But when it takes conversations for 500 people to just agree on what it is they're going to do, it takes more time. It's harder to move the needle. But for me, we have to have faith in that the process is as important as the product. And the process at Antioch, of course, is what it is. It's an incredibly beautiful thing, near and dear to my heart. And that the institution is even willing to ask that question and investigate itself, have messy conversations about what it could be and how it should partner with or other organizations to move the needle. And it's a challenging thing. I mean, I think for me, it ultimately comes down to what you do and what the community does well. What is the brand? What is at the core DNA of that community? What it does, and you do that, and you share the power, and you share the equity in that. But it's very easy to turn so hippie granola and become Patagonia that's giving away free haircuts to people somewhere in some traditionally marginalized place, that your mission creep is so far from your DNA that now it's hard to be a good ally, because you've also gotten away from what it is that you do. So like as an example for me from Antioch, what I mean, my friend Donald Strauss volunteering to do mapping for communities that need it. That's a way that you empower that community. That's the way you be a good ally. And ultimately, what I think of is most important is being a good relative to humanity, to your kin, and asking how it is that you can support what it is that they're doing. And mapping, research projects, what we're doing right now. I mean, what I've witnessed David, Al, Mihi, Rosa do their entire careers, is to empower those that have determined their course of action. So I don't know if that's helpful, but do what you do, listen, humble yourself, come to terms with one another, what your least common denominator is that makes you who you are, and then mobilize that.
I really appreciate, David, your wisdom about that whatever your allyship work is, it's got to be rooted in who you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for that.
And as a reminder, not everything that is a result of colonization is inherently evil. That's the binary system of thought, right? Academic institutions aren't necessarily bad. You know, there's a lot of good that comes from these things. It's always nuanced on the red road, right? You have to kind of parse those things out. Can't just say, as I did when I was 19 years old, all institutions are bad, I'm running away. Well, I had to do that for a good 15 years before I came to terms with the acceptance for myself that we needed the institutions in order to change, make meaningful change for the people that were living in the world that they're living in. So
I could say you just haven't spent enough time in educational institutions.
maybe I'll get a chance. I don't know. I want to go back to school every day, but
Okay. This there's something that stayed with me. Well, all the conversation is staying with me because it's such a important ideas that I just ran into today. But what about this idea that consensus building is really the most difficult path to follow? And I have many examples in my life, in classes, in these messy conversations. Actually, when I remember David Tripp, the original idea of the messy conversation is, instead of just assuming that this can be fixed, why don't we just sit with the mess? The way the conversations are going to take us is not finding a full circle of closure. It is to be open, to keep this open going on. And this resonates a lot with the messy conversation. So I really grateful that we have this space today. Consensus building or trying to work through ideas this way, in open-ended way, is the most difficult thing to do because of our Western conditioning. But I believe that is great to have this and have this reminder, because the other end of it is violence. It's like, if I don't want to build consensus, that means that I can go top down, use my power or my privilege if I have one, fix it once and for all. And then from there to war and violence and occupation and stepping on other people. It's like, it's just one tiny step. So it's a great reminder. The consensus building is the best path.
for me, that desire for permanence, whether it be immortality or sustainability, is rooted in fear. And it's something that I come to terms. I find myself seeking. I want more insurance. I want to make sure my family's provided for. I want to make. I want to put those things in place. I had a health scare this year, and I went through all those things in my own inventory of providing for my family, and but we've got this. We've got today. We've got the sunset that's about to happen. That's what we've got. And those things are really powerful. They're really beautiful, but it's hard to just be there with them, and it takes a practice, and it takes developing awareness of yourself, our own compulsive tendencies. I got another reminder, even if it's to, do your meditation on your phone, you know what I mean? Just to be with yourself is so hard now. But it's possible. And there are more and more in that paradox, there's more and more people that are realizing they've got to put their phone down. They've got to go breathe. They've got to remember. They can't just read it. They can't listen to it. You, in your own spirit, your own mind, you have to recall the words of your parents, the words of your children, the words of your grandmother, even if they hurt, so that you can have your own reminders of yourself to yourself, independent of, technology. And they come up in the sunset. They come up in the sunrise. They come up when the moon comes up. They come up when the Pleiades comes up. They come up when the Chinchasa Ipsuye to remind us that it's time of the season to pick tobacco comes up, you know. But sometimes those things do take a little bit of study. And again, and my Antioch plug is when I wanted to go learn Lakota Star knowledge, all I had to do was say that's what I wanted to learn. And that became the way that I oriented myself away from this guy, you know, back to this guy. So
thank you, David, for these important reminders. Chelsea, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David, so much. It's been really wonderful to hear your thoughts and just also messy conversation to have a space to learn from different perspectives. I was curious, first of all, I loved hearing your good experience with Antioch and the openness for you to kind of create your own or like learn what you wanted to learn. I'm part of a group where we're kind of pushing Antioch a little bit to have more anti-racist education and bring in more diverse perspectives into the room and whatnot. And I'm curious about your thoughts on, as we're pushing for more anti-racist or anti-bias trainings and whatnot, I sometimes see that the more people learn in academia or whatnot, then they kind of get on this high horse or kind of just, oh, I know this, but there's almost a missing part of learning how to be more humble and just kind of create that culture and be there with more curiosity with each other to create a more safe space to learn together.
Gosh, that's such a challenging question. It's a really challenging question. I've been to these cultural humility trainings, and sometimes I just absolutely, I just can't, you know, I might as well be in church for me. You know, it boils down to doctrine for me, and it boils down to, as you said, that those few people that have determined what it is that you're going to learn, and that you will be the recipient of that knowledge. Originally, you know, in Mihi's first class, you know, whatever Ed found, she's like, you know, this institution, although it is an institution, is not, we don't do the depositing model. And I like, you know, like I had to learn what that meant. And then like once I started to appreciate that learning is a generative experience, it's not just something that you receive from someone else. That was very powerful for me. But you know, you know, if you look back through history, you know, most of the Plains tribes, you know, somebody wanted to go do their own thing, well, go do your own thing. You know, it doesn't have to be a hostile thing. It's easy to get divorced. You know, somebody's going to go their own way, part of the institution. You know, if it becomes prescriptive, if it becomes based on a doctrine, or even somebody comes up with their own little tablet, you know, wherever maybe it comes from Moses, you know, I don't know, Scientology, if they've got their way of doing things that will guide you, then just be wary of that. So, you know, I mean, that's really that's all I can say is if you may end up with your own institution. That's not necessarily even a challenge to Antioch. You know what I mean? But you need to be generative in your disposition and curious in your approach to learning. And you know, you'll continue to learn, and it may result in new iterations of Antioch. There may be people that, you know, shift the whole center of the institution because their choice is to, you know, learn something new. And the folks that are trying to keep things the same, you know, just do that. The forms of life, of institution, of structure, the structure always changes, you know, but it's trying to keep up with spirit, and spirit is moving faster than we can keep up with. So I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm talking gibberish metaphysical stuff now. Anyway,
Yeah, it seems to be that
I'm sorry.
that
Keep trying, keep learning, whatever it is that you're doing, as long as it's not prescriptive, whether it's a training, you know what I mean? If it's storytelling to me, then you're learning. If as long as you're listening and your agreements with one another in the room are to have some empathy and willingness to listen, then you know a group of people will form around that, you know, and that's good.
Thank you.
Cece,
Come
you love
on.
the metaphysical stuff. You want to comment a little bit more, Cece?
Oh, I came in a little late, so but I love to hear talk of spirit, and I've just really enjoyed what I've heard from you thus far, David. And I have a friend, we're checking in on our metaphysicals. How are your metaphysicals today? I appreciate that dimension.
I'll never forget when I got to David's class and I was like, wait, metaphysical means what? I was just like, wow, we got different definitions. I think I kind of like yours. It's so great to see your smile, Al. For a couple years there, you know, Mark Twain was biblical for me. You know, and had a lot of fun in your classes, a lot of great reflection and a lot of great conversation. Mark Twain, we had a whole class on Mark Twain. Boy, oh boy. I'm sorry I didn't make it to your 50th. It was on my radar. That was my birthday weekend. Couldn't pry myself away from sitting on the mountain.
David, I also really appreciate you making the distinction between this and this, right? Making that conscious choice to make time to come back to center of self and reconnect, because everything around us feels like it's just constantly pulling us away at every second. And it really is a choice to disentangle yourself when you can from it. And so important.
Thank you so much. Dr. Elaine, I would love to hear just a few words from you. I'd love to hear your experience of what we've shared today and honestly learn what I can take away from this, what you can mirror for me. This is learning for me.
Well, I was going to say I'm learning so much and being able to reflect on your experiences when you were younger and now, and just about your people and how those experiences have shaped what we see today. It was also interesting when I was listening to David's question to you about changing communities and your answer, because it seems that some things have happened. We see more in indigenous communities, and I think that's inward, that development, because I don't see as much changing from even the allies, if you will. So I just think we have to keep forward. But listening to your remarks today have been very helpful. And I'm thinking back to the topic that David opened up with, and some of the courses that I've been dealing with Antioch over the years. And then, of course, the reason Messy Conversation was even developed from, going on 4 years ago. So all of these intersections is it's just a learning experience, and we just have to keep going.
That's it.
I think we have to keep going. We've learned that from our ancestors, that need to keep going. Some very, powerful words were said today, and I think we're all reflecting on it. But thank you for coming.
Thank you. See, we got an N. Is it Nabi? Nabi?
Nabi. An N is Nabi. Hi, Nabi.
Hello. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed just listening to your perspectives. A lot of the times that I'm here, I'm in domestic conversations, I'm learning new things, and so absorbing it and then kind of looking back into it. We do have a recording and then look at have a resources section that I get to look back at, and I'm really appreciative of your time, and so thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
And
Clarence,
David, whenever you can, you should drop in on Domestic Conversations. We would just love to have you and get your ideas, and as we're moving along.
thank you for that.
We'll include your other email in the mailing list, Dave,
Okay.
so that you can easily get everything.
Well, I miss Antioch tremendously, but it's a pillar of who I am. The community that is Antioch is something I always have a little nostalgia for. I used to the same van that I res hopped in for 15 years was the van that I showed up in Antioch, and I'd park in that parking structure kind of across the way there, and I'd pop the top and I'd make my coffee and I'd do my homework and I'd go to class, and I'd look down off that parking structure, and there's a beautiful tree there. As you enter the parking structure out there in front, there's a beautiful tree, and it was a forked tree. And it was always powerful to me that I could be sitting on kind of concrete structure there, Culver City, and here's that same symbol, that is so essential to my life, that I live out in the oceans of prairie in South Dakota for years, so find these things kind of representing themselves in our own consciousness as we travel, and those meaningful kind of touchstones. I just want to say that I hope each and every one of you find something that you relied upon that's of personal meaning for you in your journey, and it helps you to continue in your walk and your path towards service to your relatives, which is all living things. Standing, flying, swimming, creeping, crawling, as my uncle used to say. And all those that are suffering today, having a hard time. So thank you to each and every one of you. And, again, my deepest gratitude to my former teachers at Antioch, and, pass it over to our facilitators here. Any final words?
Well, it's just David.
No, I just want to let David know that that tree is still there. So
he knows the one.
I do know the one. I'll let it know you said hello.
Thank you.
Well, it's gonna be an open-ended conversation. I refuse to close it. But No, we're reaching the almost the 5:30 mark. For those that need to leave, please feel free.
Thank you. It was wonderful to meet some of you and see the rest of you, and travel well.
We'll be
You
in
as well,
touch,
David.
David.
too.
We'll be in
Thank you.
touch. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.